Thank you. My name is Simeon Mandrinos, and I'm working for Swinburne University of Technology here in Malaysia. And my topic for today's discussion is about exploring the relationship between the internationalization and decoupling. Now, this is, I would like to mention about it that my research is part of an ongoing study, and that means it's still in development. But I would like to share with you some of my preliminary findings, and I hope I will gather valuable feedback from your part as well. The agenda is I will try to explain the relationship between decoupling and partial internationalization with respect to de-risking, and then, of course, I will conclude. Now, internationalization has been discussed in the literature extensively. It assumes that the international development of different parties they follow a gradual, stepwise process, and this process is often influenced by interrelated interactions, coupled interactions, and this, let's say, perspective highlights opportunities to explore the concepts of de-internationalization and decoupling. Now, the international development suggests that the protection of key industries with technological advancements is very important for businesses internationally, because countries, industries, and firms, they strive to establish their relationships through technology, and their interaction, of course, may lead to tensions arising from standards, from institutional standards. Now, in the case of the evolving relationship between the European Union and China, institutional policies, we see they establish the standards and expectations of their interactions between European Union and China, while the practices, what we see, they embody the commitment to these standards internationally. The interaction between policy and practice, particularly when conformity now drives commitment to standards, we believe increases complexity of parties, in particular European Union and China, adjustment internationally. Now, complexity arises from the risk of conformity that represents an indirect form of adjustment. And conformity is clearly influenced based on our findings by expectations that are not formally codified. In other words, there are informal standards, while compliance is a direct form of adjustment that establishes formal standards with commitment, ensuring that we have to fulfill these standards. In other words, compliance ensures that standards strictly comply to regulations, to formal regulations, and of course, for the reason to avoid penalties, and of course, to ensure adjustment, clearly direct adjustment. Whereas conformity refers to practices which are informal. In this particular case, they are the specific recitals. Okay, these are like informal standards. Okay, they provide the background to understand regulations that probably they're not legally binding. Now, while recitals do not carry the same legal authority as regulations, they serve as informal standards. And this is what actually we will be using in our in this particular research. Now, in the view of formal and informal standards, we understand that commitment ensure adjustment to their expectations, formal or informal. And now this commitment is very important to ensure how compliance and conformity explain risks, and how the risk between policy and practice, of course, may lead to adjustments, direct or indirect. As a result, countries like the European Union are facing complex interactions from the Chinese side. Adjustments, direct or indirect, relates to technological advancements. What it highlights a risk between policy and practice of the European Union industries. Now, this interaction of policy and practice emphasizes an alignment between what is highlighted by the policy and how it is carried out in practice. Now, this framework basically explains what I just highlight, the relationship between policy formal and informal with informal standards, practice between compliance and conformity. In between is the relationship between commitment and expectations, where risk plays a major role to explain direct and indirect adjustments. Now, we take the case in the context of European Union and China debate of the battery electric vehicles. The interaction of key industries with technological advancements shows that, according to formal standards of the implementing regulation and the informal standards of the recitals of the provisional regulation, the EU market would have been different if large quantities of subsidized Chinese imports have not been present at prices which undercut the union prices. Now, because the European Union auto industry, strive to establish its technological influence internationally, the interaction with electric vehicles imports from China leads to tensions arising from formal and informal standards, as I just explained. In this case, we look into regulations and recitals. Now, as established in two different recitals of a provisional regulation, we see that the stocks of the Chinese electric vehicles is actually the main risk in the European Union industry that complicates the union's international interactions. Within the meaning of the article of the basic regulation, the electric vehicles imports, however, do not pose a risk to the European Union industry, as the European Union industry, there is a transition to electric vehicles, which is required by the European law, that this law establishes rights and responsibilities for everyone. Essentially, the European Union industry needs to align with a European policy that sets the formal and informal standards. And this will ensure that there is the transition to electric vehicles follow the European Union established regulations without causing any harm in the Union. However, the European Union policy explains that it is the practice of subsidized imports which increases the risk and threatens the viability of the Union's industry. Without fair market conditions, the European electric vehicles industry will not be able to reach the necessary economies of scale under the present unfair competition. And that means, in the absence of unfair competition, the European Union industry would have sold, for example, more electric vehicles on the Union market, while reducing costs, taking advantage of potential capability, for example, to spread fixed costs over sales. This would have enabled the European electric vehicles industry to de-risk by setting prices at more profitable levels within the context, of course, of the transition of the market from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Now, in the case of electric vehicles, it appears that formal and informal standards impose risks hindering internationalization of the coupled interactions. And as a result, balancing risk and adjustment to fortify interactions involves the concept of de-risking to sustain economic growth. Now, exploring the notion of de-risking emerging from complexity, we believe, is crucial to help us understand the concepts of decoupling and de-internationalization. Now, to explain the above, we first highlight that formal and informal standards may deem legitimate, however, risks and the complexity emerging from technological advancements related to European Union and China can lead to institutional challenges such as incompatibility, response, and overlap. For incompatibility, it shows that there is a difficulty in establishing standards within the specific interests of countries to advance technology effectively. With response, we highlight the importance to manage standards within the specific interests of countries to advance technology effectively. And with overlap, we refer to the dispute that arise when different standards clash within the specific interests of countries to advance technology effectively. Now, in this context, both entities, European Union and China, align their practices with their own national interests for technological advancements while recognizing the impact of their interactions. And this alignment highlights that countries, industries, and firms originating from those countries, they operate in a manner consistent with the national interest for technological advancements, influenced by a de-risking perspective to interact internationally. Now, this type of de-risking alignment facilitates responses, institutional, diplomatic, to ease constant tensions surrounding the interest in technology. However, it similarly highlights that risks increases complexity when the parties, countries, industries, and firms prioritize their own interests, which of course can create a boomerang effect that may harm the economy and credibility of their responses. As a result, we see a complex network of responses, and I will just highlight just a few to emphasize. The battery electric vehicle profitability in the European Union shows that the situation of the union's industry continues to worsen and becomes complex by the massive influx of Chinese subsidized imports, which of course continues to increase the risk and complexity of battery electric vehicles to the union's market because of price threat. Now, this significant level of financial losses because of Chinese subsidies jeopardizes the European Union battery electric vehicles industry to invest and eventually be able to reach the level of profitability required to become sustainable, and of course, to respond to the markets internationally. Now, according to implementing regulation, which is the formal standard, and the recital of the same regulation, which is the informal standard, the European Union investments in battery production will not reduce the risk of the Union's response to BEVs. Even if the European Union boosts its battery production capacity, it will still rely on China for key compatible materials like nickel, lithium, and cobalt for making their own batteries. In another response, according to the implementing regulation, but different recital of the same regulation, the use of subsidies will pressure to offset the effects of countervailing measures that, of course, increase the risk from the electric vehicles competition. This, however, will not stop imports of battery electric vehicles from China. It will just make competition fairer in the European Union market. In another response, according to an article of the basic regulation, the Union's battery electric vehicles industry is in transition and rapidly evolving from internal combustion engines. The battery electric vehicles market significance is recognized by both European Union and China in their own discussions, ongoing consultations, and of course, what they're trying to do, they try to identify the right means, such as in this particular price may effectively de-risk and end the constant tension in their responses. Now, de-risking, as we observe, encourages responses, institutional, aimed at ending tensions. However, risk comes to the forefront when national interests create incompatibilities that countries, industries, and firms must navigate to explain complexity, and without a clear adjustment, a direct adjustment, a substantive adjustment to the institutional standards, this, we believe, may lead to means-ends decoupling. In the battery electric vehicles, risk of technological advancements, means-ends decoupling, we believe, exists when the European Union and China national interests overlap with industry and firms' interests. Now, even though it looks like everyone is following the same standards, formal, informal, the European Union and the Chinese side, they prioritize their own interests over technological advancements. Now, in this presentation, I will just provide only 4 policy, formal and informal standards where national interests overlap with industry and firms' interests in relation to information and the need to maintain technological advancements. Of course, there are a number of more cases, examples, but we just only focus on 4 in relation to information and how we maintain technology advances. In the first case, in the recital, in the informal standard of the implementing regulation, the European Commission explains that the Chinese side deliberately refused to provide important information as a whole, while certain relevant parts were redacted, although readily available to Chinese. In another recital of the implementing regulation, the Chinese side claimed that it has at all times cooperated in good faith with the Union standards and has consistently sought to facilitate the work of the European Commission by providing all relevant information. In another overlap, in the informal standard of the implementing regulation, the Chinese claim that their side they have been illegally and discriminatorily denied a full and proper opportunity to exercise their rights of defense against their compliance of EU standards, which of course, according to Chinese, comes in violation of the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. In another recital, an informal standard of the implementing regulation, formal standard, the European Commission accepts the fact of missing information, yet this information did not impede the completion of the investigation, and therefore the European Union rejected the claims of the Chinese. In another overlap, in a different recital of the provisional regulation, the European Union explains that the Chinese side are those who deliberately withheld information that was readily available, and they cause difficulties that impede the subsidy investigation of the European Union Commission. In an article of an implementing regulation, the Chinese side explains that the European Commission has intentionally chosen to exclude certain data to create a desired outcome in their analysis, which is unfairly targeted and selective. And the final overlap I will just highlight here is in the informal standard of the provisional regulation, the formal standard, the Chinese side explained that the battery electric vehicles imports are indispensable for the union market because these imports are necessary to innovate and maintain competition. In another recital of the provisional regulation, the Commission explains that in the risk of booming consumption of battery electric vehicles, the union's industry was consistently losing market shares at the expense of subsidized imports from China. Now, to summarize, the descriptive overlaps show that differing interactions lead to tensions arising from standards, formal and informal, recitals and regulations between the European Union and China technological advancements. It highlights the concept of means-ends decoupling. Now, each overlap showcases an adjustment, which can be indirect, disconnect between the methods one party employs, which are the means, and of course the desired outcomes for both parties. Now, this reflects how policy interaction can lead to ineffective practice resolution in international relations, especially in complex areas like technology advancements. However, apart from de-risking and decoupling, countries, industries, and firms may respond to challenges of institutional overlaps with partial de-internationalization by three things: balancing institutional standards together with risk and complexity, pacifying institutional standards while appeasing risk and complexity, and bargaining institutional standards to compromise with risk and complexity. Balancing involves adjustment, direct or indirect, to find the middle ground where the at least minimum institutional standards can be met. Pacifying involves adjustment, direct and indirect, to mitigate the impact of institutional standards. And bargaining involves direct adjustment, direct and indirect, in mutually seeking resolution to institutional standards. Now, to provide two examples that focus on bargaining and balancing, pacifying, and bargaining, as described in recitals in two different informal standards of a provisional regulation, the EU Commission confirms that the risk of outright import stop is not only unrealistic but also complex due to the attractiveness of the union market for the Chinese electric vehicles industry. In another recital of the provisional regulation, the purpose of the countervailing duties is not to stop the imports of electric vehicles from China, but to minimize risk and restore the level playing field on the union market that is distorted by the subsidized imports from China. In the relationship between formal and informal standards, the recitals and the three different recitals and provisional regulation, we see that the balancing, pacifying, and bargaining occurs. Balancing, for example, exists as the European Union recognized the attractiveness of the market to Chinese producers, and by putting an effort to meet institutional standards without imposing extreme pressures. The European Union, they tried to maintain interactions with Chinese while managing risk associated with technological advancements. With pacifying reflects the European Union need to mitigate the impact of market pressures from subsidization of the Chinese imports, but the EU chooses measures that address concerns of challenges while maintaining interactions. And bargaining finally occurs as the European Union, while considering maybe a potential fallout from Chinese technology advances, it negotiates the terms of how countervailing measurement aiming for a solution. And by focusing on mutual interest, the European Union aims to reach agreements that satisfy both parties of interest. However, when parties of interest coexist in tension, shows that while they embracing risk and complexity, the interaction may result in partial de-internationalization where firms navigate through means-sense decoupling. And this is a tactical response to find ways around technological advancements while maintaining the presence internationally. Two cases I want to refer here. The case of Volkswagen that announced to exit China's Xinjiang region, and the Volvo exits China production of electric vehicles and relocates to Belgium, which of course it can be considered both as exit as a divestment. Now, to conclude, in our effort to explore the concepts of the partial de-internationalization and means-sense decoupling through the notion of de-risking, we focus on two key challenges: the institutional response and the institutional overlap. To explain the impact of the relation, response and overlap create a type of complexity that countries, industries, and firms must navigate when national interest increases the risk of interaction that emerges from conformity, which represents the indirect form of adjustment, which is influenced by expectations that also are not formally codified. Now, this complex interaction, informal and indirect, between expectation and adjustment, creates a facade of commitment, which of course it helps us to see that leads to means-ends decoupling. Adjustment to formal standards happen, but this comes without the means really impacting the ends. And of course, this making hard to show how commitment reflects adjustments to informal standards that may lead to partial de-internationalization. And this is the final framework. Basically, is
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but unfortunately, the time is over. So probably we should do a quick wrap up.
Okay, I'm all finished. Like you give me 5 seconds. This is the final framework. Okay, the relationship, but now here commitment and adjustment are obscure. And thank you for that.
Thank you, everyone. I don't think we have the time for the Q&A, so we will start our next session in 2 minutes. Thank you, Simone, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.